why can you only see the top of my head? How weird is that? But that's what you can see of somebody facing imprisonment at the courts at the moment, some of the time. I'm going to bring it down. So imagine that you have been arrested, maybe for something you don't think you've done, and you've spent 2 nights in police custody, 2 nights with very, very little sleep and not great food, very, very stressed. And then you have no choice as to whether to come to court for your court hearing. You have to appear on video for a hearing where you may be imprisoned from the police station. And that's what's happening now in the courts, partly due to the Covid-19 outbreak. So my name is Penelope Gibbs, and I'm a visiting fellow of Kellogg, but also run my own charity, Transform Justice. And Transform Justice is a kind of criminal justice think tank, which over time has done a lot of research and advocacy about what's happening in the courts and about defendants' rights to a fair trial and a fair hearing. And I'm afraid that's difficult now. It's difficult for people to get a fair hearing, but it's also really difficult for people like me to work out what's going on. So, when COVID-19 struck, most criminal cases were stopped. So you've probably heard about jury trials being stopped, but actually you may not know that a whole load of criminal cases are continuing. And these are cases where the police have arrested somebody, they've detained them in police cells, and then they have to appear in court at the next working day that they can, so that they're not imprisoned for too long. And these cases, these first appearances cases, which can be for a range of crimes, minor and much more serious, are going on all the time in magistrates' courts and virtually, by video only as well. They've done it because they're worried about the health risks of transporting people from police cells to court cells, because they would have to get in a van, go to court, be in court cells, be dealt with by court security staff, and so on. And the idea is at the moment that they're reducing the number of people who, as it were, have to handle a defendant who might possibly have COVID. And there's not great protection around. So they very hastily set up in all these police custody suites a room where they've set up a video camera. It's like we would do in our own home, except, and actually sometimes it is just a laptop, like I'm doing now. And they've set these up really quickly so that they can beam the defendants into the court. And in the court, you have the judge, the prosecutor, and sometimes the lawyer. So how do we know about what's going on? With great difficulty. So we have a principle in this country of open justice, but at the moment we've got pretty much closed justice. And I have had a massive struggle to get any access to the courts. First of all, I realised that actually there were court hearings going on remotely, or with at least an ability to get into the court hearing by video. And so I thought, well, that's the way to see a court hearing without actually going to the court. So there are lawyers accessing it by video and others, and the defendant themselves. So I found out about a court where they were having all virtual hearings, and I have tried, and I have tried, and I have tried, and I have failed. So in theory, it's definitely possible for a member of the public to, as it were, join a digital public gallery. But in practice, the judge can say no, and I think the judiciary as a whole is very, very worried that members of the public may record either video or phone recording hearings to which they've got access. I mean, it would be quite possible, it has to be said, but on the other hand, that means we are sacrificing access to court hearings. People are not seeing what's going on, and that could be miscarriages of justice, so it's important. So I gave up at a certain point, and I thought, what about going to court in person? And there, the guidance in the law is really opaque. It says you can, essential travel, it counts as somebody who's participating in a court hearing, but to me it wasn't at all clear that Joe Public, just wanting to observe a hearing, was participating. But anyway, in the end, that was clarified by a government minister giving evidence to a select committee, which he did. And he said, yes, the public has access. So, foolhardy though I may be, I got on my bike to my local magistrate's court because I was really keen to have a look. And that's when I saw the video hearings in operation. So these are hybrid hearings. And what is important is that they're important. The hearings are important. These are defendants who are going to plead guilty or not guilty. Those who plead guilty could be sentenced to prison on the spot. Those who plead not guilty could be remanded to prison on the spot. And some of the ones I saw were into prisons where they'd be lucky to get out of their cell for half an hour a day because of the problems of COVID. So they are really important court hearings. And what I saw was concerning, to say the least, because even in the public gallery, you really can't see the screens, the video screens, which are coming in from the police station very well. So the physical court is still working, the court you'd be familiar with, but in the court there are a couple of screens and you strain to be able to see them. They're at an angle which is difficult to see. The defendant, you can see the top of their head, like you did me at the beginning of this. Sometimes you can see more, but sometimes you can see much less. That it's really, really difficult to see the defendant, partly because they're so far away. So it's a tiny figure that one sees who should be the centre of the court process. So they're on video. Sometimes the lawyer is also on video. Sometimes they're in the court. And I've discovered that there are real problems going on to do with using these video hearings. One is that lawyers don't seem to be able to get hold of their clients before the hearing. So normally they'd have a extensive consultation with their client before the hearing so they know what happened, what the offence is, who the person is, etc., etc. At the moment, if they're lucky, the lawyer can get hold of their client on the phone, but that's really it. And then they're not, a lot of the time they don't seem to be properly briefed. So I saw a case where a defendant popped up on the video and the lawyer was in the court and the judge asked the lawyer, "Is that your client?" And the lawyer actually said, "I don't know," because he had tried to speak to that client on the phone, but the client had mental health problems and hadn't spoken, but had never seen the client. So he couldn't actually verify whether it was his client or not. I mean, they went with the case. But that's just an example of what's happening. And then also, during the case, they can't speak to each other. So normally in a traditional court, if the defendant wants to correct something or whatever, they'll kind of like whisper to their lawyer, or the court is cleared and they can have a conversation. This is simply not happening. So once the case starts, there's no possibility of a confidential conversation with the lawyer, or it's with great difficulty. So that is an issue as well. What's interesting to me about these video courts that are running now is that they're not totally new. And I can understand why they've been set up because of the health risk. But actually, previously, the government was planning to digitise and use video for a lot of courts for cost saving, because they want to close courts and save money on the court system. And so they'd already been trying these police video courts actually in 2010 and more recently in Kent. And what I would say is that the research is not extensive, but it has some really worrying features, which were backed up by my observations of the courts. So the worrying features in the research is that definitely the video hearings make it much more difficult for the lawyer to develop any rapport with their client or really understand what whether they want to plead guilty or not guilty before the trial or before the hearing. And also critically, it seems to change the behaviour of the defendant in the hearing and afterwards. And you might understand this. You know, it is really exhausting being on Zoom, and it's much more difficult to have a human contact with someone. So we are on Zoom as professionals, businesses, and also friends. Imagine you are accused of a crime and are facing prison and are trying to concentrate and participate on video. There's a disconnect, particularly with a court where the language is highfalutin and so on. So there's evidence that defendants on video are more passive and that they kind of tune out of what's going on, which is against one of the principles of justice, which is that defendants should be able to what's called effectively participate, which is understand what's going on, interject and all that as you might imagine is a good thing. I think the other issue about video hearings is that there's a hint, or more than a hint, there's some evidence from two government studies, one from 2010 and one that's just been published, that there's a really strong correlation between people who appear on video and higher prison sentences, and in fact people who appear on video and not choosing to use a lawyer. Those two things might be connected. So it's a really poor idea to not use a lawyer for these first appearances, particularly if you're facing prison or conviction or whatever. But the people on video tend to use a lawyer less than those who are in the physical court. And then the other one is that the judges appear, there's a correlation, there's more immediate custodial sentences when they're sentencing somebody on a video rather than somebody who's straight in front of them. Nobody knows why. One could conjecture that maybe it's two things, maybe both, one or the other. One is that if the human person is not in front of the judge, then they've got less, as it were, engagement, empathy. It's more of a disconnect. It's kind of easier for them to mete out a prison sentence. And the other issue may simply be that it's so much more difficult for the defence to defend well somebody who they haven't met face to face either. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about that, but also to say what's a way out of this. One way out would be for the police to detain fewer people at the moment in this pandemic, and actually that would be possible. I mean, I saw one young man who'd been arrested and detained in police custody for possession of a really small amount of cannabis. Another for being in the borough of Camden when he had an order not to be in the borough of Camden, but he hadn't committed another crime. So what we're talking about is not all, but some pretty minor crimes going through this custody, police custody, being detained there overnight, usually, and then having to appear on video. The defendants are getting no choice about whether to appear on video. So that's just a snapshot of what's happening in the courts under COVID. Will they keep with this video system? I really hope not. But if they do, one of the things they could do, and it sounds simple, but it's expensive and not that simple, is to improve the tech so that you can really see, everybody in the court can see properly the defendant and hear the defendant, crucially, which is definitely not possible at the moment. If you've got any interest in these kind of court matters, I blog regularly at the Transform Justice website. I tweet at Penelope Gibbs too, and I'm on LinkedIn as well. So do get in touch if you're interested. And that's it from me. Bye.